What we also have is something called conditional execution or selection statements. And these are features of a programming language that allow for the control of a computer program's flow of execution to branch depending on Boolean conditions or the results of various tests. So as we've seen previously, if one thing is smaller than or greater than or equal to something else, depending on that test, that will return either true or false. So in other words, relational operators. So I have a few of these ways of making decisions basically in your programs. We have if statements and then we have switch statements. We'll talk about switch a bit later in another lesson. For this lesson, we only want to focus on Booleans and if statements. If statements are really useful if you want to make decisions in your program. And if you remember, I talked about a computer program executes sequentially. In other words, it will move from one line to the next in execution. It will finish the statement on one line, then it will move on to the next statement on the next line. All right. Now, in this way, we can decide whether or not we want to execute a block of code. And this grants us a very basic method of programming decisions into our C++ programs. Of course, there are other ways of moving the execution around so that it is not sequential. So for a function, for example, when you execute a function, execution will go from the current place to that function will execute. Once finished, it will then return execution to the previous spot, okay, where it stopped basically. But in this case, we are not concerned with that for right now. We simply want to talk about decisions. And later on, again, in a later lesson, we'll talk about functions as well and various other features. This is the basic syntax of if statements. So have the if there, you simply write if, then parentheses, and in between that you have some Boolean condition. Okay, if that Boolean condition is true, then execute the next line of code, basically the next instruction. You also have an optional else part, which if false, if that original Boolean condition is false, then you will execute that line of code or that statement. We prefer this version, so the version where you have the statements that should execute between a block of code, so curly brackets. So if it's only one line, then it might be okay to use the previous example, but for the most part you want to use brackets. Don't worry too much about writing less and less and kind of condensing your code. As a beginner, you should focus on readability. Okay, that should come first. Make it easy to read for yourself and for your teachers who are trying to mark your stuff. Okay, in the next example, we'll use something like a player character and a Boolean variable called isAlive. And based on whether or not that character is alive, we'll print something out to the console. If my player character is not alive, then we'll print something out to the console saying that, game over or something like that. And in the example following that, we'll take a look at health, and depending on where our health is, so if we have a low health or whether we are dead as a character, we'll print something out to the screen again. Just a few examples. We'll do bool isAlive is equal to true, and we'll do something like is my character alive, and is alive. And so what I'll do is I'll run this. You'll see we get a 1, we won't get a true or false. 1 represents true, so my character is alive. If I set this to false, and I pull and run this again, you'll see we get 0. Okay, is my character alive? We get 0. Similarly, you can do 1, you can see, or 0. And you can also do, and we can do a temporary integer, and we'll assign that to that Boolean. And you can see this will be 1 or true because that is 4. So everything that is not 0 will be true. You can actually do minus something as well. and run this, and you'll see we still get 1. I'll change that to a float, something like this, and this will be true, okay, because we have this. All of these has to be 0. This has to be exactly 0, basically. Otherwise, we're going to get true. If this is completely 0, it will be false. If we have even something like this, okay, really small number, it's very close to 0, but it's not 0, we'll still get true, as you can see. But as soon as we set this to a bunch of zeros, we get 0 or false. Okay, we have 0.0. And of course you can do F here to make sure that that is actually a float. You can see 0. Similarly, what we can do is char for character, something like M. We'll talk about characters in more detail later, but you can see this will also be true. We don't get 0, we get 1. And this has to do with the fact that each character has a numerical representation. So if you look at the ANSI map of characters, okay, or symbols, they all have some numerical representation. So just keep that in mind as well. Alright, this is great and everything, but we probably want to fix the output here a bit. So what I'll do is, I'll write an if statement. So I'll do if. Okay, so if is alive, this here takes in a boolean, whether that is some expression that calculates or whether we pass it a boolean. This has to be true for whatever is inside of this block to execute. So I'll cut this out and I'll simply edit this piece of code like this. As soon as this runs, this is true, so this will evaluate it true as well. It will go and check what is that variable, what is stored in that variable. Is it true? Is it false? In this case, is alive is true. So this if statement will execute. Whatever is in this block of code will execute, and it will print this out. Is my character alive? Yes. Control F5 to run this, and you'll see that is what we get. I can set this to something like 1. Control F5, and you can see that is true. My character is alive. And this might be confusing because this is 1, but it can also be 8 or whatever. Okay. And you have to remember that this here is an integer literal that gets assigned. So even though we are not passing an int here as we did before, okay, earlier in the example, this is still an integer literal that will get assigned to this boolean. Okay, so that will evaluate to true. If we set it to 0 and we run this again, nothing will happen. We won't get anything printed in that case. So we can add an else part to this. If you remember the else part from the slides. Okay, and this part will evaluate when this evaluates to false. So currently is alive is false. So this block of code here will not execute. And since this has an else part, execution will jump over here, okay, and it will execute this block of code. So what we can do is just copy and paste that stuff. Control F5 to run this. Is my character alive? No, game over. As you can see, it did not execute this block of code. We set that to 1 and build and run this. You will see, is my character alive? Yes. To make this easier to read, we typically use the keywords in C++ to have true or false. Okay, so for this demonstration, let's do an integer and we'll call it health, and we'll set that to something like 13 at first. And then we'll do if health is smaller than or equal to 25. I'll just use the brackets here to make it easier to see. We can also do my health is greater than 75. Okay, what we can also do is, of course, if we have a health of 0, so we want to check for that as well. And here again, I'm using two equal operators. I'm not using a single one. We are not setting the health. We are checking whether or not the health is equal to 0. What we do is, if the health is equal to 0, okay, so we have a few if statements here. If my health is 0, I'll print this out. If my health is less than or equal to 25, I'm dying. If my health is greater than or equal to 75, I'll print this stuff out. So my health is 13 currently, so if I run this, I'll run this and you'll see I'm dying. And we can set that to 25. I'm still dying. Okay, so this simply means here that I'm low health, basically. Of course, we are using a scale from 0 to 100 here, and you probably want to check for that. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. So keeping it simple for right now. So basically, we don't have an else part. It's going to evaluate here and see this is false, so it will not go and execute this, whatever is between these curly braces. Here, this boolean will evaluate to true. This evaluation will be true, so it will go and execute this block of code, whatever is between that block of code. And here again, it will skip this because this will evaluate to false. Okay, so if we go and change this, let's set that to 0. Now again, here we have a problem. It says I'm dying, and then it also says I'm dead. So again, this executes from top down. So of course, firstly, it will execute this because we have a sequential execution. So it will say, I'm dead here. This first one will be true, so it will execute that block of code. And the second one will also be true. So that is why we also have I'm dying. So this is a problem that we have currently, and we'll see how to fix that in the next video. All right. So what I'll do is I'll set health to 75 and I'll run that. And I'm ready to fight. So equal to or greater than 75. That means we have nearly full health. Okay, so I don't want to get into too much of this right now. We have to cover a few more operators before we can see how to fix this problem. Okay, and we'll do that in the next video.